Um, and God is faithful to the covenant signs. If you don't believe that God is faithful to the covenant signs, ask Uzzah, who touched the ark, about God's fidelity to his covenant signs. God is faithful to the covenant signs. Father George and I do not make the sacrament. I heard a very interesting story, and it involved a Russian clergyman who was having there's some language translation difficulties, but he had heard that there was a priest who hadn't been trained well, and he was very concerned that he was so poorly trained that maybe he might not be serving really at all. And he said, well, was he doing this? Was he doing that? And finally, this man whose first language was Russian asked the other priests who were concelebrating, he said, well, did you make the sacrament? And one of the priests answered immediately back, Father, all I can do is ask. That's what a priest does. A priest asks, and a priest asks, in and for the church. The power of ordination is not, we don't believe that the teaching that the power of ordination gives you the power to quote-unquote confect a sacrament. Sacraments work because of God's promise. I can't step outside of the church and still be a priest. A bishop can't step outside of the church and still be a bishop. None of us baptized and chrismated Christians can step outside of the church and still be Christian. Everything that's given to us in the sacraments is in the context of that covenant fidelity. This is what St. Ignatius is talking about when he says, you have to be with the bishop in the church, and the church is in the bishop, and the church is the Eucharist. Note how Ignatius, maybe sometime we can go over the Ignatian text just in and of itself, but they're immediately connected to the Eucharist, and he's using the Eucharist. And you will see this when you read the patristic literature. I think Ignatius says, our faith is in the Eucharist, and the Eucharist confirms our faith. You will see very often, many centuries later, when there's a discussion about theology, people will be arguing, well, wait, that would make no sense in terms of the Eucharist. If what you're saying is true, the Eucharist wouldn't make sense, so what you say must be wrong. This is very different from the assumptions of 16th century Europe, where people thought they knew the basics of the gospel, but argued about the meaning of the Eucharist. The meaning of the Eucharist was clear in the early church. They hadn't managed to formulate the Apostles' or Nicene Creed or any of these things. And it was out of the Eucharist that these things were developed. Your first canon that speaks of there being one bishop in one place is actually Canon 8 of Nicaea. And it has to do with receiving a congregation, bishop, clergy, people, from outside of the church into the church. And Canon 8 of Nicaea has to do with what to do with the bishop of such a heretical congregation that wish to enter into the true church, because you can only have one bishop in one place. It's explicit there because it came up. Now we, poor Orthodox Christians of these times, are so accustomed to this. We live in a society which understands religion is coming in denominations of your choice, sort of like Baskin-Robbins. I kind of like Russian music, but my father's from the Middle East, so I'll have 2 scoops of OCA with a dash of Antiochian. One scoop today, I'm on a diet. We understand the church as being this sort of, our culture is a consumer culture, and you go into, you kind of pick the things that you like. The one bishop in one place is, I was looking, at these canons, and I see Canon 8 of Nicaea is very explicit, and it comes up because of the situation of a heretical conventicle joining the church. And the idea is that if you're going to take a whole group and let their clergy either be accepted or ordained as clergy in the true church, what then do you do with the bishop? And by the way, the solution is, if the bishop allows, he may have the bishop who is converting may, at the permission of the real bishop, have the title of bishop as an honor, but he can't rule. There can only be one bishop in one place. Now, it's very interesting, in this canonical literature, the one which explicitly says you can only have one bishop in one place is in that one canon. If you look at canons which assume that there is only one bishop in one place, I mean, I don't have time to sit here. I kind of started and I was looking at the apostolic canons, which come before the Nicene canons. I'm like, well, about 2/3 to 3/4 of them assume that to some degree or another. So, I mean, the one you can remember if you're writing down or trying to remember these things is Canonade of Nicaea. I would like to give you a vignette to show you something, and Father Meyendorff talks about this, how one of the things that is really notable about the schism between our church and the non-Chalcedonian churches, Copts, Armenians, blah, 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 is that it was at that time that really rival hierarchies with seemingly equal, claim to be there had been schismatic heretical bishops in the past. That's why Canonade of Nicaea was made to regularize them. But those only developed when a group was clearly, completely outside of the church. You have to remember, it took a couple centuries for the lines to be completely drawn in several of these cases. And so when Ambrose was elected, the previous bishop in Milan was an Arian. And so Ambrose, and Ambrose, if you might recall, Ambrose was a catechumen at the time, but he was selected and became a great saint. That's an exception to the rule, by the way, of laying hands on neophytes. Exceptions to rule prove the rule, not the exception. By the way, just there was great controversy over who the bishop would be. The previous bishop was an Arian. And the Orthodox didn't immediately set up another jurisdiction. This was in the time when what council was going to become clearly recognized was not entirely clear. And everybody understood there would only be one bishop in Milan. And if the next bishop was Arian, it just meant you didn't go to a church that commemorated the local bishop. Your church would commemorate the next nearest right-believing bishop. But you didn't set up another bishop. When a situation like that happened in Antioch, where there were two claimants at the same time, it was a major international scandal in the church. It was a huge, huge issue because there's one bishop, and that typifies the one Christ who celebrates the one Eucharist in one place, and it's a complete church. The people of God surrounding their bishop, who is their leader, offering the Eucharist, is the complete church in that place. It's not just a portion, it is the complete church in that place. You will find some people that, kind of emphasize, I think a little overboard, the distinction between the local ecclesiology of Ignatius and the universal ecclesiology of St. Cyprian. My gut instinct here, and how I was always instructed by my friend whose ecclesiology is a specialty, is that, of course, you're not talking about two opposed things, you're talking about two aspects of the same thing. The bishop is the complete church in his place, but he is in communion with the rest of the church, and exactly all of his power, if we would even use that word, within his own sphere comes from being the personification of that unity of the local church with the church of the past and of the future and in all other places.